Daniel had always been cautious, constantly wary of the eyes that followed him from the shadows, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His life had become a daily battle against unseen enemies, and the overwhelming feeling that something or someone was out to get him. Every glance from a stranger was a potential spy, every whisper behind him was a conspiracy plotting his downfall. His medication helped dull the paranoia, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel met Lila at a support group for people struggling with schizophrenia. Lila was different. She wasn't paranoid or fearful like him, at least not in the same way Lila saw people vividly. They would sit beside her, talk to her, tell her stories, and guide her through life as though they were real. Sometimes she even mistook them for being alive until they disappeared without warning. Her hallucinations were companions, but also tormentors, constantly blurring her sense of reality. The two instantly connected. There was something magnetic in the way they understood each other's delusions. Lila could empathize with Daniel's distrust of reality, and Daniel in turn admired how Lila embraced her world of hallucinations, even when they frightened her. One evening, after a particularly intense group session, Daniel and Lila decided to take a walk together through the park. It was there that they both first saw him, a man standing in the distance, leaning against a tree, dressed in a long black coat. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to pierce through the twilight. His presence was unnerving, but what struck them most was that they both saw him at the same time. "Do you see him?" Daniel asked cautiously, unsure if it was another trick of his mind. Lila nodded slowly. "Yes, he's watching us." The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there observing. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. Normally, Daniel would brush off such a sight as part of his paranoid delusions, but if Lila saw him too, that meant he was real, right? The stranger appeared again the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes in the park, sometimes at the group sessions, always in the periphery of their vision. Each time he stood silently, his gaze fixed on them. Neither Lila nor Daniel knew what to make of it, but they couldn't shake the feeling that this figure was important, perhaps even dangerous. As the weeks passed, the presence of the man in black began to weigh on them. Daniel's paranoia, once barely manageable, now spiraled out of control. He became convinced that the man was part of the conspiracy. He'd long feared the final piece of evidence that someone was tracking his every move. Lila, on the other hand, began to feel a strange connection to the figure, as though he were one of her hallucinations made flesh, someone who had crossed the boundary between her mind and the real world. They decided to confront him. One night, after a support group meeting, they followed the man into an alleyway. Heart-pounding, Daniel grabbed Lila's hand for support as they called out to him. "Who are you? What do you want?" Daniel demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The man slowly turned to face them. His eyes were cold, emotionless. "I'm here for you both," he said cryptically. "You've always known I was coming." Lila gasped. "I've seen you before," she whispered. "In my dreams." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You're not real, you're just another hallucination, you can't be real," he muttered, but deep down he wasn't sure anymore. The man smiled, a cold, eerie smile. "What is real?" he asked before turning and walking away, disappearing into the darkness. After that night, things began to unravel for both of them. The man appeared more frequently, not just in public spaces, but in their homes, their dreams, their most private moments. Daniel started seeing him in reflection shadows, even in the eyes of strangers passing by on the street. Lila's visions grew darker too. The figures she once saw as benign now whispered sinister things to her, urging her to follow the man, to trust him. The line between delusion and reality blurred further. Were they both hallucinating the same person, or had their minds somehow fused their delusions together? Every time they questioned the man's existence, he appeared again, making it harder to dismiss him as a mere figment of their troubled minds. In desperation, they turned to their therapist, Dr. Klein, but even she couldn't explain the phenomenon. "It's highly unusual for two individuals to share a hallucination," she admitted, "but your conditions may be feeding into each other. This man might represent something deeper, a shared trauma or fear." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He became obsessed with uncovering the truth. Late at night, he'd pore over conspiracy theories, convinced that this shared hallucination was a government experiment, or worse, a supernatural force targeting them. Lila, meanwhile, grew more detached, following the man's silent commands, disappearing for hours at a time with no memory of where she had been. The final confrontation came one stormy night. Daniel, consumed by paranoia, called Lila, telling her they needed to meet. He had found something important. They met at an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, a place Daniel claimed held the answers they sought. But when Lila arrived, Daniel was different. His eyes were wild and his hands trembled as he clutched a notebook filled with scribbled notes and drawings of the man. "He's here," Daniel whispered. "He's been guiding us all along." Suddenly the man in black stepped out of the shadows. "You've finally understood," he said, his voice calm and measured. You're part of something much larger than yourselves. In that moment, Lila and Daniel both felt a terrible clarity wash over them, a realization that perhaps they had never been schizophrenic at all. Perhaps the man had been orchestrating everything leading them to this very moment. Or perhaps it was their illness taking complete control, merging their delusions into one final terrifying crescendo. As the man stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying flame, Daniel and Lila faced a choice: confront the truth, whatever that might be, or give in completely to the madness that had taken over their lives. In the end, the question remained: was the man ever real, or had their shared delusion consumed them both entirely? The Story Vault.